We have a connection to our physical space, and this gives us different degrees of confidence about the meaning of things. And different philosophers put different emphasis on this sense of sensual engagement in the world. Some make it a primary issue, and some denigrate it as illusory. So a philosopher like Plato primarily trusted in mathematics, and thought the physical manifestation of nature was illusory and full of error. And likewise, if you study Buddhist philosophy or a lot of Asian philosophies, they have the sense that the senses produce what the Sanskrit term is samsara, the illusion of reality, samsara. So there's this distrust of the five senses. There are all sorts of theological permutations based on this mistrust, because at the same time, the Buddhist philosopher will say, you're most fortunate to be born into a human body. It's better than being born as a god, because of course, Buddhist philosophy believes in rebirth. And you could be reborn as a god, or you could be reborn as a human. The Buddhist philosopher believes that you're closer to enlightenment if you're born as a human. You have more at stake. You have more, pardon the expression, flesh in the game. And you have more of a sense of compassion, which is a chief means for gaining enlightenment and Buddhist thought. So I can't get into all that now. Maybe we'll go through the whole iconography another time. I studied Buddhism for some time, some years. I went to India and studied in India, and studied in the Tibetan cultural area. And I'll share some of that with you sometime. But if you go back to ancient philosophy, there are many connections between Greek philosophy of the time of Plato and Asian philosophy of the time of the Buddha, and some of the Hindu pundits. On the other hand, you have this other tradition that's very involved in physicality, physical nature. Anybody that's a philosophy student, I'm sorry, correct me as I go along, but the Epicureans would believe that the senses are by and large true, that you're looking at a tree, it's a tree, it's not an illusion of a tree, it's a tree. And that belief system can be built on these verities, on these truths. So there's that sense that in actually perceiving ourselves as being alive, we're given enough. God, I've got lint all over my coat. Talk about materiality. And it's the snares of materiality, keeping lint off a coat. It's one of the biggest snares. And now in the 21st century, we have the whole issue of neuroscience and the brain, and what does the brain create an illusion of a world? What nature of being are we in this hologram of a representation that human brains create? To what extent do we question what we see? Now, I've been studying philosophy recently. I was very wrong on one point, because in painting we use the term realism to represent the idea that a painting could be a painting about a tree. I go out to the field, I get my paints, I go out, I paint, I see a tree, I paint the tree on the canvas. That's called realism. But reading back into the idea of realism from the time of Plato, that's true and it's not true. Plato didn't believe in the tree in the field. He believed in this ideal tree floating in the cosmos. So in that sense, painting the tree in the field is realist painting, because what you're really painting is the idea of the tree. So the idea of the tree was real, not the physical material thing. The material thing was a fake, a phony. It's the idea of the tree that's real. I think modern idea of realism is that a tree is a tree. I touch the tree, I feel the tree, I bump my head on the tree. It's real. It hurt my skin. I climbed up the tree and fell out of the tree. So that's more modern ramification of what a tree is, as opposed to this iconic tree, this idea of the tree. Now, when your brain is developing, you're 16 or 17 years old, you might look at a tree sometime and it has this aura of iconicity to it. It happened to me, where you're looking at a tree and suddenly it's a magical tree. It's the tree. It's the ultimate tree. It's the icon of the tree. It's the idea of the tree. And it can have an aura of almost sacred dimensions as you see this sacred tree. That might happen and open and close in your mind at a certain point as your brain develops and you get all these flashes of reality. Some people would take hallucinogenic drugs to reopen that eye and to see everything fresh again like that. I'm not recommending that. If you do it, have a doctor on hand or a nurse, doctor and a nurse. They're talking about legalizing psychedelic drugs in California, and it's already used in psychiatric research and treatment, psychiatric treatment.
Colorado already did psilocybin for medical purposes. They legalized that this year.
Which institution?
It was just the state of Colorado.
Oh, Colorado. Okay, yeah. It's been slowly legalized in different places. John Hopkins is doing a lot of research. And, but what would be the motivation? It's not really to have, a lot of people would do it to have fun or have a wacky experience, but the more serious researcher would be doing it in order to cleanse the eye of, cleanse the window of perception. And that's the name of a book by the British author Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception, where he's advocating some of this. The point, I think, is that you can cleanse this door of perception without taking drugs. You can do it, amongst other things, by painting. and you can clean your door of perception, your window of perception, how you see the world. Well, that would be a motivation to do that, would be to, and I think in the development of the brain is when ages gets, from childhood up through early middle adolescence through early adulthood, you have these moments where you see things in a fresh way. And there's an ecstatic sense of that you're standing in front of something that's been bequeathed to you by the universe. And people that have a kind of sad, depressing sense of things is that things have lost that freshness. So art has a particular job in that it helps us maintain that sense of freshness of the senses as things open to us. Now, we're putting a lot of emphasis here on opticality, and that's another issue, that the optical is overvalued or overgifted with prestige, and that there are 4 other senses besides, there's taste, smell, touch, hearing, and vision. And some philosophers say that the West has overemphasized the visual over the other senses. And we've lost a balance of the senses because opticality has a sense of detachment. You can take a telescope and look at a planet thousands and thousands and thousands of light years away, millions of light. You can look at a star millions of light years away. You can look at a planet thousands of miles away. And so that sense of capture, our sense of sight that captures that dimension, gives it a certain prestige, but perhaps more than was healthy for a balance. The criticism would be that by overvaluing vision, you might lose a sense of humanity. You might be too detached from the feeling substrate of humans who live and suffer. And by the way, there's a free film noir. It's pretty hardcore. It's pretty rough. It's on YouTube. It's called Border Incident, 1948. It's about the migrant labor situation in California in 1948. And all the comments I read about it had to do with the fact that not much has changed, and that the issues then are the issues now. It mostly has to do with the exploitation of farm labor in 1948 and the horrible practices that you see in 1948. You see them practiced now. So in that sense, comments say that the film is timely. Border Incident, 1948. But I thought of it also because it's visually so stunning. It's principally shot at night, and it was not so easy to shoot film at night in 1948. They didn't have the film stock. The technique was not as advanced as today. Today, you can take your phone out and get a pretty good image at night, or your camera. But in 1948, you knew how you really had to have expertise in lighting to see what you were, to get a good outcome in 1948. So it's visually stunning. It's directed by a famous hardcore film noir director named Anthony Mann, who did a series of amazing movies through the 50s. Border Incident being one of them. We'll talk about film noir sometime. I haven't introduced it formally, so I will. Point is, a lot of these films are cinematic wonders, and they're free online on YouTube. The cinematographer was a famous guy named John Altoon, who perfected this ability to shoot film at night, and to get these startling contrasts of, most of these films are black and white, so they have a startling contrast of light and dark, which is a whole nother issue having to do with visuality I'll get into at some point. Light and dark, which is interpreted in some metaphysics as good and bad. The good is light, the bad is dark, which has created untold tragedy in our world as we are prejudiced towards the light and against the dark, and all the horrible ramifications of that in terms of racism that one could note, in terms of light being good and dark being bad. And I would also, just introducing the topic, point out that some scholars and artists have turned it around. And for example, in the opera Tristan and Isolde by Wagner, night and darkness is good, and light and daytime is bad, are bad. And I'm not going to go into that right now. I'll save that for another lecture. But he's flipped the metaphysics of light, and he extols the night and darkness, and he denigrates and judges in a negative way the day and light as being prejudicial and judgmental, etc. Another artist who did this was Herman Melville in Moby Dick, who writes a chapter on the whiteness of the whale in the famous American novel Moby Dick from 1848 or 1850, Moby Dick, and on the horror of the whiteness of the whale. And he comes up with all sorts of examples of when white is horrible, including, I think I remember, the sepulcher, which would be the tomb. Generally speaking, if you're in a desert country, you come upon this bunch of tombs in the desert in Egypt or Israel. They're by and large white, and the bones are white, the ossuaries are white. There's a whiteness to death, he's trying to say. So anyway, that's a side issue I'll get to on another occasion. Talking about sense certainty today, being plunged into the senses. And I've introduced the topic, and I'll get back to it. I talked about the nature of visuality and philosophy, and the fact that visuality is questioned as extolled as this premier form of human gathering of information and thought and inspiration and meaning. And also some critics have said that visuality is overdetermined, it's too prejudicial against other forms of knowledge and sense certainty. Anyway, I'm going to go on to the pictures in a minute. I've got your names. Write them down again real quick. And Danielle, you might have seen some of this, but I don't think so. You might not have either. I'm going to show one or two pictures I showed last Thursday, just as an introduction to the ones I'm showing today. And also, maybe to remind you that you saw them last Thursday, or maybe you saw them on Tuesday. I don't remember. You saw them. You'll see them again briefly as an introduction to the ones I'm going to show today. And why not see the, I took a class in Asian art. Here comes one of my stories, I'm sorry. At Cooper Union in New York in the 1960s. And the professor had this long beard. He looked like a German Zarathustra, like a German philosopher from the Alps. His beard was down to his waist. And he was lecturing on Hindu and Buddhist art and Chinese art. And he kept telling me through the semester and the whole class, we're going to have a big slide presentation. I'll be back in 1 minute. I have to get an example to make a point. He had a slide projector. He kept saying, we're going to have this big slide identification examination at the end of the semester. And it's going to be really hard, and you better study for this. And you're going to have to identify all these slides I'm going to show you during the final exam. And everybody was scared to death, and everybody was studying all their books and references. And then the day of the presentation came, and the professor came in. And the funny thing is, we didn't see a slide projector, but he talked about a slide examination the whole semester, and we were scared to death. And he's going to pull out the slide projector at some point. And instead of pulling out a slide projector and installing it and put it in, he stared at us for a period of time. And then he said, identify slide number 1. And held up slide number 1. What? What? Slide number 1? I can't see slide number 1. I see you have a slide in your hand, but I can't see the image. This was pure Zen. This is what you call Zen Buddhism, Zen art, Zen Buddhism, where it's like smacking the student over the head with a rod. And I guess everybody wrote something down. It was a lesson of sort. I remember it to this day as if it were yesterday. Identify slide number 1. My God, I think he might have held up 10 slides. I don't know. You couldn't do that at Penn State now. You get sued. But I don't know what I'm, talking about visuality, identification with things, et cetera, et cetera. I guess that story hooked up to my comments earlier. You'll have to decide. But at any rate, I'm going to show some slides today. Not like this. These are great. I still have tons of these. I put them in my slide projector and project them. They have a certain quaint quality to them. Boy, you would do a lecture though. You'd have about 700 of those in a slide carousel, and you'd be heading into the lecture hall with your slide carousel full of 700 slides, and maybe you hadn't hooked a little ring on top of the carousel. And of course, then you would trip and fall, and all the slides would fall out on the ground. It's sort of like dropping the Thanksgiving turkey. It was not a good thing. It happened to me at least once. More typically, the slide projector would just jam. That happened all the time. That was a drag. Trying to get the slide projector to work. Some slide would jam into the projector and wouldn't move along. Anyway, there are plenty of technical problems now teaching, especially in the class. And occasionally Zoom. I mean, if this happened to me last semester, suddenly Zoom dropped. And so everybody, students today can know that the if you do lose connection, it could be a technical problem with Zoom. It could be my system. It could be their system. So that it's not like we're out of the realm of technical problematics, but things seem a little more reliable. Unless you're in Texas, where you don't have any power today. And I lived there for years, and don't get me started. Basically, Texans believe in pay to play. If you can't pay, you can't play. And so, as a mayor said in West Texas the other day, you're on your own. Everybody's on their own. Unbelievable what our country's come to. But at any rate, getting back to the theme, I will now share my screen. Well, I'll give everybody a 5-minute break to just shake out, and then I'll be right back in 5 minutes. All right, we will continue. And I will begin with this. And we saw this recently. We saw this the other day, I believe, the Tiaplo. Again, the issues having to do with illusionism and the grandeur of the optical. There's a lot of illusionism in this picture. You might notice if you look closely at the corners, the figures that are in gray, those are supposed to be sculptural figures in the architecture. And then the figures that are in other colors, they're supposed to be the living figures that are participating in the scene. So he's going from these gray figures that are supposedly sculptural figures in the architecture to the bodies of participants in the scene. Great invention, great artifice. Tiaplo, we'll see more from Tiaplo. And I showed this Picasso from 1928 of this very reductive form, as opticality is stripped of its sensual, tactile dimension of holding an object. When the eye sees something and they sense the surround of the object, they sense the volume of the object, that means that the eye, the mind of the eye, the eye's mind has a sense of the ability of grasping the object. If I see an apple, realistically painted apple on a table, and I have the light and dark on the apple, and the shift from warm to cool colors on the apple, the illusions that's produced is my sense that I can go out and grasp the apple, grasp it in my hand. The apple's graspable. I can touch it, I can hold it, I can pick it up, I can move it. There's nothing in this picture that's graspable. If you go back to the Tiaplo, I might have used the word habitable. If we are in the illusion of this painting and become one of the gods in the painting, we inhabit the painting. The painting's habitable. We can live and breathe inside the painting. We can insert ourselves into this fictive space and live within this illusory space in our minds. So likewise, the forms are graspable. I could grab the rein of the horse. I could grab some shield or sword in the picture. I could grab somebody's arm. I could grab the side of the ceiling, the hole in the ceiling. The amazing thing about the picture is there are things where there's an element of groundlessness, and that some figures may be falling in this picture, which was a great theme at the time. You had the saved and the damned. You had people that were saved that would be flying up to the clouds, lifted up, floating up, the sense of levitation, no jeopardy, you're safe. And then the damned figures would be falling down, falling into the abyss. And that's a very corporeal sense, which is what I'm talking about today, the corporeal sense of inhabiting space. If you're falling in space, you're inhabiting it in a kind of scary way as you fall. If the apple falls off the tree, it inhabits the space it's falling in for a brief moment. It transects that space. But in the Picasso we're looking at here, there's nothing to grab here. There's nothing to grasp. It's ungraspable. So you could say it's pure opticality here and no haptic sense other than certain threat metaphors. The hair looks spiky. It looks like the hair looks like it looks like a stiff dog brush or something. If you poke somebody with it, it might hurt. The nose looks like it would hurt if you got speared with the nose, etc. And we looked at this last time, this rather sweet, scholarly type guy there's nothing too negative. I don't get any negative threat out of this. It just seems like a question. I don't get a panic theme here. It's more asking a question. But the space has a certain habitability to it. The pants, because of the lighting on the pants, the highlights on the trousers, they look graspable. They look like one could reach out and pull them off. You could dress in those clothes. They're metaphors of equipment, of things that you can use. I can use that shirt. I'm cold. I'll put the shirt on. I need some pants on to go outside. I'll put those pants on. They're familiar. They're touchable. They're holdable. There's nothing holdable here. It's really, if I didn't, we were talking about signs before and signage, and I didn't mention it, but I mean, as much as I think this is a picture of a mirror, I think more literally, it's a sign of hands off, of don't get close. It looks like a panic sign. And I guess that white and black, which I mentioned maybe to you or another class, was sort of a convention of mirroring that you could see in a graphic novel, in a graphic illustrator's tool book of how to illustrate mirrors. You might put in these slanting light and dark lines to show the illusion of the mirror interpreted by graphic design. But in this case, this sign looks more like a sign you might see on the side of a railroad track or the side of a highway. Look out, beware, caution, caution ahead. So in this sense, the mirror looks more like, you know, a very cautionary sign. And if you interpret it that way, the gray head, that almost looks like shock suddenly. That mouth looks like shock as they're looking into the mirror and seeing this image either of themselves or something else reflected in the mirror. Anyway, today I'm going to take you on a jump from these images to my own work, going back to my classic period that I became pretty well known for. And we can talk about some of the issues that I've just discussed in relationship to my own work. And sorry if it seems narcissistic, but it's just a teaching mechanism in order to develop some of these themes. So this is a painting from years ago. After this, nothing. Very old painting, 1986. You see some of the lighting technique that we saw in that man's trousers, that silhouetting of light with a core of shadow. That's very effective for making volume without building everything up in a too rotund a way. This is a picture of Monaco in the background, I believe. It's either, I do believe it's Monaco, back in the day before it was overbuilt. I might go back to these. This is from a couple of years earlier, Big Fall from 1984. This is in the Whitney Museum of Art. And some of the elements of the heads we just saw in the Picasso, especially in the guy's head, the spikes for hair, and even the colors relate to a kind of maybe panic sign. They're really the colors of a stoplight. You got the yellow for caution, you got the green for go ahead, and you got the red for stop. So it's a very elemental um, array of colors there: red, green, and yellow. Slow down, stop, and go ahead. And people related these to neon at the time. You don't really see a lot of neon light anymore. You saw more of it then. This is 6 by 11 feet. Some of the brushwork has to do with a kind of panic in terms of, I better paint this fast. The curtains are kind of panicky. I really do like the curtains. Get that out of the way. There we go. Love the curtains. This is another painting. This is typical of the shapes of the paintings back then. This is a bad slide. I'm sorry. It's called Double Suicide. And it was kind of a joke. Sorry for it's a sick joke. Can't really joke about suicide. It's not funny. But I guess it was funny at the time. Anyway, I did a small painting, and then some people asked me to blow it up, and I made a much bigger version, which was shown in the Venice Biennale. And now the big version of the painting is in a museum in California. So it's a small oil painting that became a 6 by 11 foot oil painting. And in a sense, I was looking at a kind of cognitive dissonance in the paintings. There are elements of the background environment that are very permeable, habitable, as I said, breathable, atmospheric. So the sky has a certain romantic aspect to it. It's habitable, breathable. But you get to the coat and the hair, the guy's hair looks like some sort of um, razor sharp lizard's hair, like the fin on a dragon or something. So you wouldn't want to run your fingers through that guy's hair because you would cut your fingers. And his coat looks crinkly, like it might be made out of aluminum or something. So there are a lot of indicators in the material, especially in the bodies outside the window, that are anti-haptic, anti-graspable. That adds to a certain speed and a certain kind of panic speed. And then the people in the bed likewise have some of that, but they look a little bit more volumetric. You see a cute old-fashioned telephone like you might have seen somewhere in an antique store. At the time, they weren't old-fashioned yet. Nice little painting. This is much more recent. It's from, 10 years ago. And it's called Floating Isolates. I'm interested in the whole theme of levitation, floating figures. You saw that a lot in the Tiepolo. She looks like she's hovering, the woman, and the male figure looks like he's falling. And I didn't think that out. I didn't work it through a computer. I have no idea what that means. I made up the figure of the woman, and the guy I think I got out of a photograph. Again, the background looks more habitable than the figures do in a way, but it's a pretty lush background, pretty romantic. The pool looks like I could dive into it. So it had to do with my whole attraction and repulsion to these places. Very dialectical, these pictures. Loving and hating resorts. I love them and I hate them. I love them because they're kind of exciting. I hate them because they're so phony and false, and they're so they're aspects they're aspects of tourism that are social evils. And everything here is built to be an allurement, to lure us into this romantic realm. And at the same time, there's a moral dilemma. I like this one. This is called Sins of the Scopophiliacs. If you've read your Sigmund Freud, a scopophiliac is somebody that's addicted to looking. So a peeping Tom might be a scopophiliac. If the peeping Tom is telling the judge, Judge, I can't help it. I just can't help it. I've got to look. I'm compelled to look. I can't not look. I am stuck looking. He's a scopophiliac. In a way, visual artists are scopophiliacs, hence the sins of the scopophiliacs. Because, as I said before, some people don't want us to look. And even just a minute ago, looking at the last painting, Floating Isolates, I was talking about the moral dilemma of being attracted to the glitz, to the fake. And then as I've shown some of these pictures, I talk about the environmental cost of keeping a city like this running. I believe this is an old picture of Hong Kong. Hong Kong's much more built up now. This is Hong Kong from the 80s, probably. But the environmental cost of keeping these glowing jewel boxes running. They serve ultimately no great human need other than entertainment and prestige. There's a great image this week from the power failure in Houston, where the downtown area where nobody lives is bright and shiny in downtown Houston. And then the area around downtown where 5 million people live is in complete darkness. So interpret for me why the downtown area would be like a bright, shiny jewelry box in a department store, and the homes of millions of people surrounding the downtown area are pitch black, completely dark. This is another painting that's a bit older. I've made up a lot of the architecture here. Again, it's kind of fantasy architecture from tourism. And the tourism architecture varied over the years. It's fascinating. Las Vegas had a great moment when the architecture in Las Vegas, the vernacular of the architecture in Las Vegas, was authentic to Las Vegas. And sadly, that was all torn down. And now most of Las Vegas looks like somewhere else. So if your grandparents went to Las Vegas in the 70s or 80s, they saw Las Vegas that was re-quoting Las Vegas. They'd made up their own architecture. There were aspects of it from LA, aspects of it from Miami, but they made up their own architecture. Then they tore all that down, and now you have a little Paris, you have a little New York, you have a little Rome, you have different fake places from around the world instead of what was authentic fake, which was Las Vegas back in the time when Las Vegas was just faking itself. Anyway, this kind of architecture is more in keeping with Miami architecture or Las Vegas architecture, and it had to do in a way with early 20th century science fiction, Flash Gordon, and kind of the vulgarization of modernism in the early 20th century, going through the late 20th century. And now I'm at my age, I can be nostalgic for it because there's little of it left. It's been torn down. You see it in bits and pieces here and there. It also had an aspect of futurism, and nobody really cares about the future anymore physically in a literal way. It's hard to envision a future. But in the 1930s or 40s, people were very interested in the future. They thought the future was utopian. They thought that utopia lay in the future, and the architecture had something to do with the utopian impulse in modernism, and hence that kind of speedy, aerodynamic, streamlined look of architecture and design in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that went on for a few more decades, but everything stopped. That vector, that sense of movement, that hurtling, the buildings and trains and cars. A car was designed to look like it was hurtling when it was standing still. A train locomotive was designed to look like it was hurtling when it was standing still. A toaster in the kitchen and an Airstream trailer both look like space nodules. All a toaster in the kitchen was an enlargement of an Airstream trailer that you might see on the street. Same shape, the same material, reflective metal. And it all had to do with an idealization of speed. And I think the problem today is our sense of speed and acceleration is faster in so many senses than actual physical speed that we can't visualize it. We can't visualize it anymore. Speed back then had a kind of physical reality. It looked like Superman flying over a building in a single bound. That was what speed was. Superman leaping over a building in a single bound. Now speed is some sort of element of a computer going from 0 to 1 in such a hyper fast way that it's not physically describable other than by the most extremely minute, accurate instruments. I hope that makes sense. This kind of relates to the first image also. This is a painting I did called Magus of Turin. It was shown in Los Angeles a couple of years ago. It has something to do with the fall of the damned, which is a great Western theme. Now, in Asian art and Hindu and Buddhist art, you did have the damned. They were usually in charnel fields, but they weren't falling. I can't think of that many figures in Buddhist or Hindu art that are falling. They're flying oftentimes, but they're not falling. The fall is a Western trope. Get that in medieval and Renaissance art, the fall. It might be because of the scripture, the fall of the damned, which just wasn't a big image because in the Eastern philosophy, they were more interested in magic and the idea that I will learn how to fly. So I won't have to worry about falling because I will learn how to fly. But in going back to Icarus and Daedalus in Greek mythology, I'll fly, but then my invention will start failing and I'm going to start falling and get the vertigo effect of falling. So it would be interesting to do a kind of world almanac of sensations of falling from different cultures around the world and what the idea of falling means culturally in different cultures around the world. It's going to vary from culture to culture. And then enough said on that, but I think tall buildings go back to the Tower of Babel in the Old Testament. So there was and ancient people saw the pyramids in Egypt, whereas in India, the tallest things were the mountains, which were much too tall to ever threaten to be, they were never going to be threatened by human artifact. The Himalayas are taller than anything we'll ever build. Whereas a lot of the towers were probably built in deserts where there weren't that many super tall mountains. And so man was unrivaled in a certain sense. The pyramids are the most mountainous things in that part of Egypt. You get my drift. Anyway, this is a modern building from the 20s in Turin, Italy. I believe this is the final picture, and it's another falling man. This is called Plain as a Lie. This was a painting of mine. It's 7 feet wide, 7 feet round, as is the last one. And this painting was used as an advertisement for the uh, back in the day when MTV was a big deal on in rock and roll and on cable. MTV was a huge thing, and they ran this ad in Rolling Stone, which was a big deal music magazine back then. And they were going to make this their logo, but then the magazine and the company started getting a lot of criticism of my painting, this painting, because they felt that I was extolling suicide. And clearly he's on a pier. He's going to be landing in water. And he looks a little clueless. But I'll go into it another day. The whole idea of jumping, falling, jumping, and slipping. You can fall by accident. You can fall by intention. And then we mentioned if you're Superman, you can actually fly. So it's just a big metaphor of our sense of habitability on planet Earth, how we exist on this planet, and our fantasies for escape. So with that, I will terminate my comments today. And if you have any questions, let's open up on Tuesday with some questions for anything I said today. If you want to look up the movie I mentioned and you're interested in knowing what film noir is, there are lots of comments online about film noir, what it is. It's an American style. Some people would say that this is a film noir image. I was influenced by film noir. But at any rate, that's all online. And then the movie I mentioned was Border Incident, 1948, directed by Anthony Mann. Cinematography by John Altoon, black and white film about the struggle of immigrant labor, and the commentary being that the crimes and sins that are committed in the movie in 1948 are being committed today. And we're not talking about the crimes of illegal aliens. We're talking about the crimes of people that exploit them. Hope to make that perfectly clear. The illegal aliens, if you even care to use that terminology, I do. The migrant farmers are there to work to sustain themselves. And the people that are exploiting them are vicious criminals. So let's just make that clear. But at any rate, the movie's online. If anybody wants to look at that, open to comments. On Tuesday, if anybody has any comment on what I've done this week or today, we'll open with comments and then we can go from there. And next Tuesday, generally speaking, I don't want to talk too much on Tuesdays to prepare for my evening class. So you can reach me by email, you can text me, and there's going to be another snow event. I think it's ongoing through tomorrow morning. So be careful. Proceed with caution. Good time to stay in and make art. I'm going to let you go now, and I'll talk to you on Tuesday. Goodbye.